On the morning of August 6, 1945, a single American bomber released a single bomb over a Japanese city, and in a flash of light brighter than the sun, roughly 70,000 people were killed instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. 6 days after that, Japan surrendered. It's a clean story with a clear logic. The bombs ended the war, the bombs saved lives, and the bombs were the only way to avoid a bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands that could have cost 1 million American casualties. But here's the problem. That story is dangerously incomplete, and in some ways, it's flat out wrong. The atomic bombs did not simply end the war in the way you've been taught. Let me say that again, because it matters. The decision to use them was not a single moment of necessity. It was the final act in a much longer, much darker chain of political calculations, bureaucratic momentum, racial dehumanization, and great power positioning that had been building for years before a single uranium atom split over Hiroshima. What actually happened in the summer of 1945 is a far more complicated, more human, and in many ways more disturbing story than the one that gets repeated in textbooks every August. It involves a president who inherited a weapon he barely understood, a target committee that crossed cities off a list for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity, a Soviet army massing on the Manchurian border that mattered more than most people realize, scientists who begged Washington not to use the bomb without warning, and a firebombing campaign that had already killed more Japanese civilians than the atomic bombs would, months before Hiroshima was even chosen as a target. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki wasn't a single isolated act of last resort. It was the culmination of decisions made by people who believed they were doing the right thing, and the most unsettling part is that the story we tell ourselves about it still shapes how we think about war, power, and mass civilian death today. So let's go back, not to August 6, 1945, but months earlier, because the true origin of this story doesn't start with a bomb. It starts with fire. By the spring of 1945, the United States Army Air Forces, under the command of General Curtis LeMay, had already fundamentally changed the character of the air war against Japan. On the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, more than 300 B-29 bombers dropped incendiary clusters over Tokyo in a raid that became known as Operation Meeting House. The firebombs ignited a firestorm that swept through the city's densely packed wooden neighborhoods, and in a single night, an estimated 100,000 people died, more than the immediate death toll at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Over the following months, this pattern repeated itself across dozens of Japanese cities. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, all burned. By the summer of 1945, American planners had run out of major cities left to firebomb, not because they had reconsidered the strategy, but because there was almost nothing left standing. This is the critical context that most popular retellings gloss over entirely. By the time the atomic bomb was ready, the United States had already normalized the mass killing of Japanese civilians as a matter of routine military policy. The moral threshold that the atomic bomb supposedly crossed had, in practice, already been crossed months earlier with conventional weapons. The bomb wasn't a departure from the strategy. It was a continuation of it, just more efficient. Now, layered on top of this was the question of who would actually make the decision to use the new weapon, and how that decision got made reveals just how much bureaucratic momentum, rather than careful deliberation, shaped the outcome. Harry Truman became president on April 12, 1945, following Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death, and he did not even learn of the Manhattan Project's existence until he had already been sworn in. Secretary of War Henry Stimson briefed him on the bomb for the first time on April 25th, less than 2 weeks into his presidency. Truman inherited a $5 billion secret program that had been running for years, staffed by tens of thousands of people and driven by its own institutional logic. The scientists had been recruited, the factories built, the uranium enriched. An enormous amount of political and financial capital had already been invested in the assumption that the weapon would eventually be used. Historian Gar Alperovitz and others have argued that by the time Truman took office, the momentum behind using the bomb was less a considered strategic choice, and more the inertia of a massive bureaucratic and scientific enterprise that had never seriously planned for the alternative of not using it. There was, in fact, a formal body tasked with deciding how the bomb should be deployed. It was called the Interim Committee, chaired by Stimson, and it met throughout May of 1945 to determine target selection and the manner of use. Here is where the story gets deeply uncomfortable, and where most conventional histories miss the mark entirely. The target selection process was not primarily about military value in the way people assume. A separate target committee, made up of military officers and scientists, met in Los Alamos and the Pentagon in the spring of 1945 to draw up a list of candidate cities. Their criteria were revealing. They explicitly sought cities that had not already been heavily firebombed, specifically so that the effects of the new weapon could be clearly measured and demonstrated without the confusion of pre-existing damage. In other words, cities were being preserved, kept off the conventional bombing target list, precisely so they could later be destroyed by the atomic bomb in a way that would produce a clean, legible before and after picture. Kyoto, Japan's ancient imperial capital, was actually the Target Committee's first choice, favored for its size, its industry, and its psychological significance. It was removed from the list only after Secretary of War Stimson personally intervened, reportedly because he had visited Kyoto on his honeymoon decades earlier and considered it too culturally significant to destroy. Hiroshima, by contrast, had been deliberately spared from the firebombing campaign for exactly this reason, and it moved up the list as a result. This is not the story of a weapon used against the most militarily critical target available. This is the story of a target list curated for demonstration effect and shaped in part by the personal sentiments of a single cabinet official. Now overlaying all of this was a question that most Americans, then and now, know almost nothing about: the Soviet Union. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, Joseph Stalin had agreed to enter the war against Japan roughly 3 months after Germany's surrender, which would place Soviet entry sometime in early August. American and Japanese leadership alike understood that a Soviet invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria would be catastrophic for Japan's already collapsing war effort, potentially even more psychologically devastating than continued American bombing, because it would eliminate any hope Japan had of using the Soviets as a neutral intermediary to negotiate a conditional surrender. Historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, who worked extensively with both Japanese and Soviet archival sources, has made a compelling case that it was the combination of the atomic bombs and, critically, the Soviet declaration of war on August 8th and the subsequent invasion of Manchuria that finally broke the deadlock within the Japanese Supreme War Council. This detail matters enormously, because the conventional American narrative treats the bombs as the singular sufficient cause of Japan's surrender. But internal Japanese government records from that final week suggest the Soviet invasion may have weighed just as heavily, if not more heavily, on the minds of Japan's military leadership, who had been clinging to the hope of Soviet-mediated peace talks right up until Stalin abandoned neutrality. If this is true, then the bomb's role in ending the war was not the clean, singular cause it's remembered as. It was one of at least 2 simultaneous shocks, and untangling which one mattered more is far messier than the textbook version allows. And here is the human cost that gets lost entirely when the story is reduced to strategic debate. In Hiroshima, an estimated 140,000 people were dead by the end of 1945, when you account for those who died from burns, radiation sickness, and injuries in the weeks and months after the initial blast. In Nagasaki, the toll reached roughly 74,000. These were overwhelmingly civilians, women, children, and the elderly factory workers, students who had been mobilized for wartime labor. Survivors, known in Japan as hibakusha, carried radiation-related illnesses for the rest of their lives, along with a social stigma that made marriage and employment difficult for decades, because other Japanese feared the effects of radiation exposure might somehow be contagious or hereditary in ways not fully understood at the time. Children born to survivors were watched anxiously for birth defects. Entire families were wiped out in an instant, their existence reduced to a shadow burned into a stone step. This is not a footnote to the strategic story. It is the story. And any account that treats it as a secondary consequence of a necessary decision is already telling only half the truth. There is also the uncomfortable matter of race and dehumanization, which shaped how the war against Japan was fought differently than the war against Germany. Wartime American propaganda routinely portrayed Japanese people in dehumanizing terms that were rarely applied with the same intensity to German civilians, and historians, including John Dower, have documented how this racialized framing made the mass killing of Japanese civilians, through firebombing and later through the atomic bombs, feel more permissible to American planners and the American public than equivalent treatment of European civilians might have. This is an uncomfortable thread to pull on. And it does not mean the war itself was not brutal on all sides, including the documented atrocities committed by Japanese forces across Asia. But it means the ease with which the firebombing campaign and the atomic bombings were adopted as strategy cannot be separated entirely from how the American public had been conditioned to see the people on the receiving end. There's one more piece of this that rarely makes it into the popular telling, and that is how quickly the American government moved to control the story once the war ended. Occupation authorities in Japan, led by General Douglas MacArthur, imposed strict censorship on Japanese press coverage of the bombing's medical and human effects for years after the surrender. Photographs of the dead and dying in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with scientific studies documenting radiation sickness, were suppressed or classified, and Japanese doctors treating hibakusha were restricted in what they could publish. At the same time, American officials worked to promote a specific framing of the decision, one built around necessity, efficiency, and the lives supposedly saved, before independent journalists like John Hersey were able to publish accounts. Most famously, Hersey's 1946 New Yorker piece that finally gave American readers a ground-level sense of what the bomb had actually done to the people living beneath it. Even then, the dominant framework, the bomb as tragic necessity, had already taken root, reinforced over the following decade by memoirs from Truman, Stimson, and other officials who had every incentive to present their decision as the only reasonable one available. This is how historical memory gets built, not through some grand conspiracy, but through the ordinary process of powerful people, writing the first draft of history in a way that reflects well on the choices they made, while the people who suffered those choices, occupied, censored, and thousands of miles from Washington, had far less power to shape how the story would be told. And there is another dimension entirely, one that American war planners were acutely aware of, even as they told the American public the bomb was purely about Japan. Several historians, including Alperovitz, have argued that demonstrating the bomb's power was also, in part, a message aimed at Moscow, a way of establishing American dominance in the post-war order before Soviet troops could occupy more of Asia and before post-war negotiations over Europe's future began in earnest. This argument remains genuinely contested among historians, and it would be dishonest to present it as settled fact. But the timing is impossible to ignore. The Potsdam Conference, where Truman first learned the Trinity test had succeeded, it was also the venue where American diplomacy toward the Soviet Union noticeably hardened. Whatever the precise mixture of motives, ending the war with Japan was never the only consideration in the room. Meanwhile, there were people inside the Manhattan Project itself who saw where this was heading and tried to stop it. In June of 1945, physicist Leo Szilard, one of the original scientists who had helped convince Roosevelt to start the atomic program in the first place, circulated a petition among his colleagues at the Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory, arguing that the United States should not use the bomb on Japanese cities without first offering a demonstration and a clear opportunity to surrender. Szilard and other scientists, organized through what became known as the Frank Report, argued that using the weapon without warning against a civilian population would be a moral catastrophe and would set a dangerous precedent for the nuclear age that was about to begin. More than 70 scientists signed the petition. It never reached Truman's desk in any meaningful way. It was buried within the bureaucracy, considered and rejected by the interim committee, which concluded that a demonstration might fail, might not shock the Japanese leadership into surrender, and might waste one of only 2 available bombs. The scientists who had built the weapon, believing it might deter a greater evil, found themselves with no meaningful voice in how it would actually be used. Now, let's bring these threads together, because the true complexity of what happened in August of 1945 is not any single decision, but the way several separate calculations converged into an outcome that, viewed individually, no single actor had fully intended. You had a firebombing campaign that had already normalized the mass killing of civilians as standard practice. You had a new president who inherited an enormous, self-justifying bureaucratic machine built around the assumption the weapon would be used. You had a target selection process, shaped as much by demonstration value and one man's honeymoon memories as by military necessity. You had a Soviet Union whose entry into the Pacific War may have mattered as much to Japan's surrender as the bombs themselves. You had a broader diplomatic calculation about post-war power that layered uncomfortably on top of the stated goal of ending the war. And you had scientists who saw the moral stakes clearly and were overruled by a committee that had already decided the outcome before it ever seriously weighed the alternative. Each of these factors alone might have produced a different history. Together, they produced Hiroshima and Nagasaki exactly as they happened, on the dates they happened, with remarkably little debate at the highest levels about whether to use the weapon at all. The debate, such as it was, focused almost entirely on how and where, not whether. What historians get wrong, or more precisely, what popular memory gets wrong, is treating this as a simple binary. Either the bombs were an unavoidable necessity that saved 1 million lives, or they were an unambiguous war crime. The truth sits in a far more uncomfortable place than either of those poles. The casualty estimates used to justify the bombings, particularly the figure of 500,000 to 1 million American lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan, were largely generated after the war, in the late 1940s and 1950s, as part of a deliberate public relations effort led by Stimson and others to shape how the decision would be remembered. Wartime planning documents from 1945 itself, including estimates from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, projected invasion casualties in the tens of thousands, not the hundreds of thousands or millions cited in post-war justifications. This doesn't mean an invasion wouldn't have been horrific. It almost certainly would have been. But the specific, dramatic numbers that generations of Americans have been taught, the ones that make the moral calculus feel simple, were substantially inflated after the fact, in service of a narrative that needed to feel clean. It's also worth sitting with just how narrow the window for a different outcome actually was. Japan's Supreme War Council in early August of 1945 was deeply divided, with some members already pushing for surrender terms built around retaining the emperor, and others insisting the war continue even in the face of overwhelming destruction. Historians have pointed out that the council remained deadlocked even after Hiroshima was destroyed on August 6th, and it took the combined shock of the Nagasaki bombing on August 9th and the Soviet invasion beginning that same day to finally break the impasse, with Emperor Hirohito himself intervening directly to force a decision, an almost unprecedented act given his largely ceremonial role up to that point. This means that for 3 full days after Hiroshima's destruction, Japan's leadership had not yet decided to surrender, a detail that complicates any narrative suggesting the first bomb alone delivered an instant, obvious verdict. The second bomb fell on Nagasaki before Washington had even received confirmation of how Japanese leadership was responding to the first one, a decision driven partly by a pre-written military schedule that assumed a second bombing would proceed unless explicitly called off, rather than a fresh, deliberate choice made in light of new information. That detail alone should unsettle anyone who imagines August 1945 as a series of carefully considered, independently weighed decisions, rather than a machine that had already been set in motion and kept running largely on its own momentum. So when you put all of this together, the true origin of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not a single moral choice made in a vacuum by a president weighing an invasion against a bomb. It is a story that begins months earlier in the firebombed ruins of Tokyo, runs through a target committee curating cities for demonstration value, passes through a Soviet army crossing into Manchuria, moves through a scientific community that raised the alarm and was ignored, and ends with post-war casualty figures inflated to make an already made decision feel more justified in hindsight. None of this erases the fact that Japan's wartime government bore responsibility for prolonging a war it had little realistic hope of winning, or that the Japanese military committed extensive atrocities across occupied Asia that deserve their own reckoning. But it does mean the tidy American narrative, the bombs saved 1 million lives and there was no alternative, was constructed after the fact, at least in part, to make an almost unimaginably violent decision easier to live with. And this matters today for reasons that go beyond historical accuracy. Every nuclear armed state since 1945 has operated in the shadow of the precedent set that August, that these weapons, once built, tend to get used, that momentum and bureaucratic investment can push decisions further than any single moment of deliberate choice would suggest, and that the stories nations tell themselves about their most violent acts are rarely as simple as they first appear. The lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not just about 1945. It is about how easily catastrophic decisions get made when they arrive at the end of a long chain of smaller decisions that each, individually, seemed reasonable to the people making them. So the next time someone tells you the atomic bombs were simply the only way to end the war and save 1 million lives, you'll know the fuller picture. You'll know about the firebombs that came first, the target committee that curated its list, the Soviet army that mattered more than anyone likes to admit, and the scientists who begged for a warning that never came. The real story is older, messier, and far more human than the version that fits neatly into a single paragraph of a history textbook. And in a world where 9 nations now hold these weapons, understanding exactly how the first ones came to be used may be the most important history lesson we haven't fully learned. If this changed the way you think about how the Second World War actually ended, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the moments in history that get simplified into myths, the decisions behind the decisions that shape the world we live in now. Drop a comment below with your take. Do you think the bombs were justified, unjustified, or somewhere in between? I'd love to hear your reasoning. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want the real history, not just the version that fits on a plaque. I'll see you in the next one.